We left off last week. We looked at 2,000 years of church history, and then the second session we looked at basically the last 100 years of church history of the Pentecostal movement. We're going to back up just a little bit tonight and back up into the Reformation some, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Baptist history tonight in order to set a framework. We looked at our Pentecostal background of the Church of God Mountain Assembly, and now I want to look at our Baptist background of the Church of God Mountain Assembly in order to understand the organization that became the Church of God Mountain Assembly. It's so important to understand our Baptist roots, our Baptist background. And I hope that, certainly, I hope that by the time I'm done tonight, you'll see that more clearly, and maybe even by the time the course is finished, it'll become even clearer. Let me say this. Here's my thesis. When I write my next book, and I redo the history of the Church of God Mountain Assembly, and I'm talking about redoing the academic work that I did. When I redo it, this is where my thesis is. You will not understand the Church of God Mountain Assembly without understanding its Baptist roots. That all of the conflict, if you will, the tension that the Church of God Mountain Assembly as an organization has experienced in the last 100 years, the tension has been between two opposing ideologies about what the church is, and it has a lot to do with our Baptist heritage, and that being the framework by which this building was built. And so we'll say more about that, I know, in the hour to come and in the time that follows it. But let's talk about our Baptist origins, and we're just going to simply ask the question: who are Baptists and where did they come from? We looked a little bit last week about 2,000 years of church history, and we said very little, if any, about Baptists themselves, and yet certainly in our area, you can't tell the story of the church without telling the story of Baptists. When they say we're in the Bible Belt, well, we're in the Baptist Belt. And so let's talk about Baptist origins, and I want us to consider, I'm going to talk about theories on Baptist origins, and we're going to look at four theories that historians, when they talk about where Baptists came from, they talk about the history of the Baptist movement, they're basically four theories about where Baptists came from. And the first one of those is what I'm going to call Baptist successionism. And this is a view that's held by many Baptists, and it just simply says that there has always been a Baptist church since the time of Christ. That the Baptist church was separate from the Catholic and the Orthodox churches, and that it ran parallel in history throughout time, that the succession of the church in Baptist churches has been passed down from the age of the apostles until now. And so that's what is meant by the phrase Baptist successionism. There's also a theory that's very similar to that, and sometimes you see them talked about side by side. Sometimes sometimes they're almost used interchangeably, but I'm differentiating the two of them, and I'll specify what I mean by that in just a second. But the second is Baptist perpetuity. So one is Baptist successionism, and the other is Baptist perpetuity. And so it's very similar to the first. The first theory is that there's always been a Baptist church, that there's always been Baptist churches since the time of the apostles. They passed down from one generation to the next. The second is Baptist perpetuity, and that is that Baptist faith and Baptist practice has always been since the time of Christ. Now the difference is Baptist succession says there's been a Baptist church since the time of Christ. Baptist perpetuity recognizes there wasn't a Baptist church but there was Baptist thought and Baptist practice. So that there were people that were operating, they wouldn't call those congregations or the thought that the individual Christians who believed like Baptists, who practiced like Baptists, have been this theory, Baptist perpetuity, and to some degree, scholars Baptist historians have leaned on it, have leaned on this work, was launched by James Milton Carroll in his pamphlet, The Trail of Blood. There's a pamphlet, a little leaflet series or booklet, if you will, The Trail of Blood, that claims that that claims a descent by modern Baptists from earlier groups such as the Waldensians, the Cathari, the Paulicians, and the Donatists. That these groups that have existed in church history throughout that while they might not have worn the label Baptist, that the Baptist movement is related to, so that the Waldensians, for example, might not have called themselves Baptists, but in thought or in practice, they were very, very Baptist by it. Now, I know I've thrown some terms out there that maybe you're not familiar with, and so let me go back. The Waldensians, Waldensians, the Waldensians. See, there's always been Waldens, as long as we can go back. Actually, the Waldensians were started, were led by a man by the name of Peter Waldo, who renounced his wealth. And the focus was on lay preaching rather than on a trained bishopric or a priesthood. He preached a strict adherence to the Bible, and so he had a lot of followers that gave creed to his teaching. The Cathari are a group that also. And I wish I thought I had in my notes time frames for each of these. You have to look them up. Cathari, or just Cathars, if you're not looking at the plural for the group name themselves. Basically, they're anti-sacerdotal. Now, there's another $2 word for you, too. The idea is, when we talk about the sacraments, in the Catholic position, a sacrament is necessary and is effective towards salvation. That baptism is important. It's an important part of salvation. It has a sacerdotal effect. The Cathari said that the sacraments were not, they thought of them as being more along the lines of an ordinance rather than a sacrament. We'll talk more about that in just a little bit. And they said there's only one sacrament, and that is the last rite, one sacrament that purges us from all of our sins. And they typically administered it prior to death. Paulicians were a dualistic group that rejected the Old Testament and even parts of the New Testament. The Donatists argued that the priests must be faultless in order for their sacraments to be effective. The idea was, how can priests who are not sinless, how can priests who are who in some cases are just totally immoral? I mean, we're not taking a slam in the Catholic Church, but the truth of the matter is historically there have been priests that you wouldn't call them their lifestyle Christian by any stretch of the imagination, some of the things that they've done. And so the Donatists said, well, they've got to, how can their work, their sacrament, how can what they do on your behalf be effective if it's done by somebody who's not even living right? Did you have a comment?
Yeah, did you say the Paulicians?
Paulicians, yeah.
Okay. What was the criteria that they were cutting out from that? Like you said, they were cutting out the Old Testament and parts of the New Testament. Was it like a Gnostic kind of thing?
Basically, the focus was on the writings of Paul. Now, that not to the total exclusion.
Okay.
Hence the name. Yeah, they felt we were devotees of Paul. And in Baptist thought, it's the idea of salvation by grace through faith, and that's why they will claim them as ancestors. And so that's what we see in these ideas of Baptist successionism and Baptist perpetuity. Now let me just say this. When historians do religious history and what have you, the only people who have ever bought into either one of these theories are Baptists. All right? And that's not a slam or anything, but that's just how it is. Baptist historians tend to buy into the idea of successionism or perpetuity, but more than any other serious academic would in dealing with, with origins and with history. A third theory on Baptist origin that is popular among Baptists and other historians is the influence of Anabaptists. Anabaptist influence. Anabaptist just simply means a rebaptizer. Now, I ask you, in the traditional church, in the Roman Catholic Church or in the Greek Orthodox Church, when is baptism typically performed?
Infancy.
As infants. They baptize them as infants. They become a part of the church shortly after their birth. They're christened and taken into the church. And again, in Catholic doctrine, in Orthodox doctrine, the sacrament of baptism is effective and necessary for that salvation. Anabaptizers, in the 15th and 16th century, began to teach and believe that baptism is only valid when the candidate professes faith in Christ. Sometimes it's called believer's baptism, that somebody has to make a profession of faith. That baptism is only effective when they're able to actually make that. And so in many traditions, some of the more common Anabaptists that we're familiar with are the Mennonites, the Amish. Some of these that get grouped into some of the first Anabaptists were those that recognize as adults that begin to rebaptize now that I have come to an understanding and have a personal relationship with Christ or whatever it was. I'm able to make a profession of faith on my own, and so they were being rebaptized. And so many scholars believe that the Baptist that the Baptist churches grew out of this tradition, grew out of this influence. And then one fourth theory that I want to look at, and this is the theory that most scholars accept, is that the Baptist church grew out of the Protestant Reformation. That it grew out of Anglican, in particular, Anglican separatism. And I want to just mention real quickly, I think in the first session we talked just a little bit about the Church of England, that basically Henry VIII wanted to get a divorce because his wife wouldn't give him a son, and the Pope would not grant him a divorce, would not allow it, so you don't have cause for divorce. And so instead he decided, well, you know what, everybody else is protesting, everybody else is rejecting the church, I will just start our own. And so the Church of England was launched as a protest against the Roman Catholic Church. And in the Anglican Church, with the Archbishop of Canterbury becoming the head of the church, the Anglican Church came into existence as a result of that. Within that Anglican tradition, there were those who wanted to purify the church against what they said. You know what? They said, we're Protestant, yes, I get that, but we're not Protestant enough. There were those that were saying, we're still too Catholic. We need to make some changes within our church. And those who wanted to purify the Anglican Church were called Puritans, right? And so those Puritans that we're familiar with and are most famous because of the persecution that was taking place in England against them, a lot of times looking for religious liberties, they had to leave England in order to find them, be able to practice their brand of Christianity the way that they wanted to. But there was another group that was similar to those Puritans. They said, you know what, it don't matter what we do, we're never going to purify the church inside the church. We're never going to make it what it needs to be. The only way to become what we need to be is to separate totally from the Anglican Church. We're going to have to just come out and start our own. We're going to have to come out from among them and demonstrate to them what Christianity is supposed to be. And so these separatists are those that rebelled against, if you will, England. Now, our pilgrims that came to the Plymouth plantation, the Plymouth colony in 1620 in what is now Massachusetts, they are English separatists. They said, we'll go to the New World, and in that New World we will create a city that's set on a hill where even those that will create the first society of true Christianity, where our Anglican brothers and sisters can see what we want and become that. So understand what we mean by Anglican separatism first and foremost. Now, I talked about how that many times, because of the persecution that was being launched against both the Puritans and the separatists, that because of that persecution, many times they were forced to leave England. And we know that from American history, first and foremost. But certainly the New World is not the only place that they went to. In 1606 or thereabouts, John Smith, S-M-Y-T-H, John Smith broke his ties to the Church of England and began meeting with about 60 or 70 separatists. And because of the persecution that was being launched against them, they relocated from out of England into Amsterdam. And so they went to the Netherlands, and there they were baptized as believers in 1609. So again, come back to this idea of rebaptism, of believers' baptism. And Smith wrote a tract spelling out that infants should not be baptized, and that anti-Christians, upon conversion, those who weren't already Christians by tradition, by the way, that they should be baptized upon conversion in order to be admitted into the true church. A scriptural church, he said, should consist only of regenerate believers who have been baptized on a personal confession of faith. Now, along with Smith was a layman by the name of Thomas Helwys, H-E-L-W-Y-S. And just a couple of years afterwards, when the persecution began to subside in England, Helwys led the group back into England in 1611. And the Helwys group and the congregations that came up, that sprang up as around them, they became known as General Baptists. In 1638, Calvinist John Spilsbury, and we talked about Calvinism in the first session last week, he argued that baptism by immersion was the true form. Now again, we stop and ask, how had baptism been practiced up until the 17th century? Pretty much by pouring water over the convert, or sprinkling the water over the child. And so John Spilsbury began to argue that true baptism was baptism by immersion, and the Calvinist Baptists that grew out of that tradition became known as particular Baptists, or sometimes they're called Reformed Baptists. Let me give you some key Baptist doctrine and practice. These are some of the things that will help to identify what it means to be a Baptist. Right? First of all, Baptists typically emphasize believers' baptism. And again, this is a profession of faith that somebody is they're being baptized upon a confession that I have put trust in Christ, Christ's redemptive work at Calvary. They're making a profession upon that faith. They've been baptized in the same manner that John baptized Jesus, being identified there with the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. And immersion is typically, the key form. Believers' baptism. Most baptism is by immersion upon profession of faith, and almost always in the Trinitarian formula, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. So, believers' baptism is important. A second doctrinal thought that's important is the idea of soul competency, or sometimes called soul liberty. This is the idea that each person is responsible for his own spiritual life. Now again, I'm putting everything in contrast to Catholic thought. Catholic thought says you can't get saved without the church. That the church is important, that confession to a priest and that following the ordinances of the church, that being a part of the church, the one true Catholic Church, is necessary for salvation. Baptist thought says that each individual is responsible for his own spiritual life. So that I don't go to heaven someday because my parents brought me to the church when I was an infant and had me baptized and I became a Christian. Baptist thought says, no, you are responsible, not what your parents did for you and not what the church does for you. You are personally accountable to God for your own soul. So it's the idea of soul competency or soul liberty. A third idea is that of universal priesthood. Sometimes it's called the priesthood of all believers. And I know that phrase, priesthood of all believers, may mean different things to different people. But in Baptist thought, the idea is that, just simply put, that all Christians have access to God on their own. That Christ alone is my mediator. That Christ alone is my intercessor. That Christ alone is my high priest. And I have access to God the Father through Jesus, His Son. And I have that access on my own. Baptists typically teach that there are two ordinances of the church. How many sacraments are there in the Roman Catholic Church? 7. All right? And Baptists typically teach that there are two ordinances. One of those is baptism. And we talked about believers' baptism and what we mean by that. And the other ordinance is the Lord's Supper. And sometimes, in some Baptist circles, the Lord's Supper also includes with it foot washing. And some would say, well, that sounds like 3, but most Baptists would lump them together. And so you've got two ordinances, baptism and the Lord's Supper. Now, I use the word ordinances because in Baptist thought, again, the Catholic Church uses the word sacrament. And the idea is that these things are necessary, that partaking in the Eucharist, eating the body and drinking the blood of Christ are necessary. They're salvific in their effect, that they're necessary in order to be saved. And the Baptist Church teaches they're not sacraments, they're ordinances. That Christ commanded these things, and so that's why we do them. Sacraments having the power to effect salvation. Ordinances, this is what Christ commanded, and so this is what we do. Two ordinances of the church. Also, in Baptist thought, is the idea of two offices of the church. And the two offices, if I tell you what they are? No, the two offices. Who are the officers?
Pastor and deacon.
The deacon and the pastor. Typically, the Baptist Church recognizes those two offices of the church. The pastor and the deacon. Now, of course, again, we're comparing everything to the Anglican Church or comparing everything to the Roman Catholic Church. The idea is there are deacons, servants in the church. There are also priests, and then there are also bishops. And so that there's a hierarchy. Baptist Church teaches two offices in the church, that of the pastor and the deacon. And they might use the term elder. Typically, the term elder or in this tradition, bishop or pastor are almost used interchangeably. That those titles typically mean the same thing or that they fulfill the same function. So pastor and deacon. I don't know what number we're on, but the next one is autonomy of the local church. And if you don't hear anything else that's said during the entire course, hear this, right? The stress in the Baptist thought is the autonomy of the local church. That each local body is congregationally governed. Each local church is responsible for itself. It is separate. It functions together separate. And it has all ecclesiastical authority within that body. So that no matter how it might make decisions and whether it's the lay people and the whole church votes, or whether it's the deacons that are given some authority, or the pastor that's given, that all authority in the local church is in the local church. That each separate congregation is autonomous, is separate. And so again, in contrast to the Anglican church that they separated from, or Roman Catholics or Greek Orthodox, where there's a hierarchical structure, where there is a pope, but there may be 5 patriarchs, that are recognized as equal, but Rome's a little more equal, or Rome's the first, or whatever. And each of those is divided into sees, and there's a particular metropolitans, diocese. That each local church is part of a bigger diocese, that's part of a bigger region, or what have you, a bigger bishopric, to where that there are levels of authority that go all the way up to the archbishop, or all the way up to the pope, or whichever persuasion. In the Baptist church, there is nobody that is synonymous with the pope. If you ask somebody who is the most powerful, who's got the most authority, which Baptist has the most authority in the Baptist church? Well, that's going to vary. Then you might talk about Billy Graham, having a wide circle of influence, but that's not the same thing as by any means, that in each local church, whoever's got the most authority is either the pastor or the deacon, or whoever the local church boss is, but it's in that church. And so understand that mindset of Baptist doctrine and practice. And then the last thing that I want to point out is that Baptists have always been champions of the idea of separation of church and state. When Thomas Jefferson wrote his famous Wall of Separation letter that gets quoted over and over and over again, right? And sometimes people think that it's in the First Amendment, but it's not. It's in the letter. Who was Jefferson writing the letter to?
England.
Baptists. It's a letter to the Danbury Baptist Convention. And basically, he's preaching to the choir, telling them what they wanted to hear. The idea is Baptists resent both the intrusion and interference of the government, of the state, in their local level. And because Baptists have never been the state religion, you know what I mean? They've never been the state religion. They resented having to pay taxes to pay for Anglican priesthood, or Anglican clergy members, or Anglican buildings, and what have you. And again, that is, it's time connected with that idea of the autonomous congregation. We ought to be able to put our monies into our church. And so these are some key Baptist doctrine and practice. I want to go in this next session. I want to talk about this next section. Talk about Baptist organization. We're going to look at some being able to group together individual congregations in a way so that when we talk, here's the thing that's so important to understand. When I say Baptist, immediately something comes to your mind. You know a Baptist, right? Or you know a Baptist church, or what? And sometimes whatever your relationship with them, or whatever you know about that person, sometimes we can paint Baptist with a pretty broad brush And so, well, they must be like us. That's the way Baptists are. Well, the truth of the matter is, to say that's how Baptists are is kind of a misnomer, because there's so many different kinds of Baptists that it's impossible to lump them all together nicely. And so that's why we're going to talk about why it's so helpful to look at groups. But before we do, a joke. A man was about to commit suicide by jumping off of a bridge when another came upon him. He said, "Stop, don't do it." Man said, "But I have nothing to live for." He said, "Well, maybe I can help. Are you religious?" "Yes, I am." "Well, me too." "Are you Jewish, Christian, or Muslim?" "I'm a Christian." "Me too." "Are you Catholic, Orthodox, or Protestant?" "Protestant." "Me too." "Are you Calvinist or Arminian?" "I'm Calvinist." "Me too." "Are you liberal or conservative?" "Conservative." "Me too." "Are you evangelical or fundamental?" And he said, "I'm evangelical." "Me too." "Are you charismatic, reformed, or Baptist?" "I'm Baptist." "Me too." "Are you General Baptist, Northern Baptist, or Conference Baptist?" "I'm Conference Baptist." "Me too." "Are you Conference Baptist of the 1932 Conference or Conference Baptist of the 1946 Conference?" "Conference Baptist of the 1932 Conference." 1932? "Well, then die, you infidel heretic scum." Bridge. And so even when you try to lump together Baptists together in these, the truth of the matter is there's so many things that separate, so many things that divide, sometimes in doctrine, sometimes in practice, sometimes in geography and in history. But we're going to try to group some Baptists together, look at some Baptist groups. And first of all, we're going to start with particular Baptists. I mentioned this phrase just a moment ago. And just let me say, so many Baptists, or so many issues, have helped separate Baptists into seemingly infinite number of groups. There are issues of Calvinism versus Arminianism, issues of eschatology, issues of the doctrine of separation from the world, and whether you should associate with those that are of the world. Issues of even speaking in tongues and the operation of other charismatic gifts of the Holy Spirit in the modern church, how the Bible should be interpreted, the extent to which mission boards should be used to support missionaries have historically divided Baptists, the extent to which non-members may participate in the Lord's Supper services, which translation of Scripture to use, dispensationalism versus covenant theology, the role of women in marriage, the ordination of women as deacons or as pastors, attitudes to and involvement in the ecumenical movement. So many things that separate Baptists. But let's try to keep it simple. In England, you had particular Baptists that we talked about just that I mentioned just a few moments ago. These are Calvinists in their theology, and for a refresher course, basically what we're saying is the particular Baptists believe in a limited atonement, that Christ didn't die for everybody, He only died for the elect, that the blood of Christ was shed for many, not for all, for many. And so they believed in a limited atonement, and only the elect were going to be saved. We talked last week about irresistible grace and some of the other things. And so those that identified with Calvinism became particular Baptists, and those that identified with Arminianism, that is free will, that whosoever will, and unlimited atonement, that Christ died for everybody, became general Baptists. So in England, they're in two major groups of Baptists, particular Baptists and general Baptists. Now, in America, where we want to focus our attention on, because we're going to get more specific, and get to our own roots. In America, regular Baptists tended to be moderately Calvinistic. There are varying degrees of Calvinism, whether or not you accept all 5 points or some of the points. But moderately Calvinistic, they tend to be closed communion. That is, that communion is only available to those who are, that we know are redeemed. Those who are a part of the church. the visible church that we can actually see, and we have evidence that they are Christians. They are members of this congregation. They tend to be close communion, and they tended to observe foot washing. And then there's separate Baptists, and separate Baptists are free will, are many. Separate Baptists tended to embrace the Great Awakening and the enthusiasm, the revivalism that followed it. They were called separate because in the churches where the Great Awakening was embraced, and in the churches where the Great Awakening was rejected, that the conflict that existed there divided congregations a lot of times between old lights and new lights. Now, if you do take an American history class, these are going to be familiar terms with you, because in colonial America, in colonial American religion, these are terms that constantly get thrown out there. The idea is old lights tend to be those that turn down or pulled themselves away from, decried the enthusiasm of revivals, that they tended to not be evangelical, whereas the new lights tended to be those who embraced revivalism and everything that came with it, and that typically became evangelicals. And so you got these two groups, regular Baptists and separate Baptists, and they were separate in that they separated themselves from the old light churches that decried the revivalism. Somewhere around 1800, some of these groups of regular Baptists and separate Baptists united together in Kentucky and Virginia and North and South Carolina in particular, and created United Baptist churches. Time doesn't allow me to talk about Northern Baptists and Southern Baptists and the differences there. Of course, this is a Civil War issue where the tendency was that Southern Baptists and Northern Baptists split over the issue of slavery and the place of, and ultimately the place of the freed slave within the church, split over that issue. Now the Northern Baptists tend to be more liberal politically and theologically. Southern Baptists, there are not many more groups, there are not many more conservative groups than Southern Baptists in our country today. But the United Baptists came about, and that's what we want to focus on. Let me talk about Baptist structure. And just again, I want to stress again, autonomy in the local church. Each local church is congregationally governed. Usually, deacons take care of most of the business of the church. And the church congregation might vote on issues that are of greater importance. But generally speaking, the government of the local church was seated in those deacons, the deacon board, to take care of the church. Now, while each church was independent in its own, churches might participate in an association and a group of churches in a particular region that get together for cooperation and fellowship. So in a Baptist association typically would be any number of churches within a particular region. You might ask about the Baptist associations in your region to get a feel for what's available there. But basically the idea is you need churches with which to fellowship. You need churches that when you're in revival that you can call on. They're part of the association. The association has a particular doctrine or a particular set of practices that they observe. They're similar in their worship styles. And so you've got preachers that you can call upon, not only to preach, but also when it comes time to ordain, comes time to ordain ministers or deacons within your own church. A lot of times you call on the association to come together and help to conduct that ordination service. If you've only got one minister in your church, it's kind of hard for that one guy to lay hands on somebody and separate them and ordain them a deacon all by himself. So typically you call the churches within the association to come together. They may work together on particular projects, maybe a joint mission project. They work together to have seminars or workshops, leadership meetings, strategize about how to conduct Sunday schools or other works that may be of a collective effort. And, Baptist associations, for example, right now might be working together, independent local churches working together within the association to help with things like hurricane relief, disaster relief in your area. They may work together in the association to start colleges. They may work together to start ministries that are outside of the local church. Sometimes there are hospitals that are Baptist hospitals. Well, there are very few churches, independent, local, and autonomous congregations that have the financial resources to launch their own hospital. And so they do this collectively, sometimes through associations. So those associations tend to be smaller within a geographical bounds where it's easy to fellowship with each other, to get together for participation. And then each of those associations may belong to a larger national association, an associational membership in a national convention, the Southern Baptist Convention or the Northern Baptist Convention, for example. The Southern Baptist Convention is the largest today. The Northern Baptist, by the way, are now called the American Baptist Convention. So this is just again a glimpse of Baptist structure. Now, let's get specific. And let us talk about the South Union Association of United Baptists. We talked a little bit about the United Baptists and the history of them, where they came from. Now we're going to talk about one association in particular, the South Union Association of United Baptists. And it is important because this is the group that most of the early members of the Church of God in Mountain Assembly had been affiliated with. These are the kinds of churches that they had been participating in, had been members of when holiness came to their region. So let's talk first of all about the history of the association. The South Union Association was constituted at Clear Fork Meeting House in what is now Whitley County, Kentucky, in September 1815. I don't think there was a Whitley County in 1815, right?
Not to my knowledge.
So I think at the time it was Knox County. But Clear Fork Meeting House, where in September 1815, by delegates from the Cumberland River Church, which is now First Baptist Church in Barberville, and the churches that were part of the association in 1815, they were typically and principally located in what is now Knox County. And some of the churches were new churches. They were fairly new churches. Others of those churches were arms of stronger churches. Like for example, First Baptist in Barberville is a big church. It was a big church 200 years ago. And it planted churches in these smaller communities. And so some of these smaller churches, again, Baptist churches are autonomous, independently, congregationally governed churches. Some of these small, when they started a church in those areas to reach those communities, again, we're talking about 100 years before the automobile. Travel wasn't. So nowadays people can leave Trosper or Artemis or whatever and drive into Barberville, and you can do that without any problem. Nowadays people could leave Goldbug or Mountain Ash or Saxton or wherever and drive into Williamsburg or drive up to Corbin. But 200 years ago, you didn't have that kind of luxury. And so it's so important to get churches into so many areas that you could. But some of these churches were new churches. Others had been around for some time. Some of them came out of Stockton's Valley Association. all that is known about that early history is its organization day. There are no records before 1830. But in 1830, the South Union Association had 18 churches with 489 members. And the churches had a tendency to be anti-missionary or indifferent on the issue altogether. And we talked about the issue. I didn't mention missionary Baptist churches that came about. As the idea is, should we take care of ourselves, or should we reach out beyond our own? And what is the purpose of mission boards, and whether or not churches should use them? Some of these things that help divide churches. But the South Union Association early on tended to be anti-missionary. The complete records of the association are available from 1864 to the present. And on your jump drive, there are some of the pages that predate 1900. All of the minutes that exist before 1900 are handwritten minutes in a great big thick ledger book. And they're available at their office, at the mission office building for the South Union Mountain Zion Association. And so you can see some of the pages. I copied some of the pages that were relevant, and so that you could see them. But from 1864 to the present, the oldest churches in the association are Jellicoe Creek, Red Bird, Wolf Creek, and Patterson Creek. South Union Association has prided itself on being a mother of associations. These dates don't matter, but in 1831, the Laurel River Association of Baptist Churches was formed with 5 churches from the South Union Association. In 1843, North Concord Association, by churches that were dismissed by letter from South Union Association. By 1870, it had reduced, but then it had grown again to where there were 26 churches, and it divided its territory. And those that were west of the line became the West Union Association. Those that were east of the line, stayed with the South Union Association. Now, the line was the mouth of Jellicoe Creek on the Cumberland River, running south with Jellicoe Mountain down into Elk Valley, into Tennessee. And so the West Union Baptist Association typically today has churches in what is now McCurry County, Kentucky, and Scott County, Tennessee, while the South Union kept the churches that were in what is now Whitley County, Kentucky, and Campbell County, Tennessee. And again, these things are important. The Mount Zion Association was founded in 1885 when the New Zion Church left to join other churches in California. East Union Association in 1891 with 7 churches from the South Union Association. 1906, Elk Fork Association established itself with churches from out of the association. In 1997, the old Mount Zion Association that had come out in 1906, or I'm sorry, in 1891, the Mount Zion Association came back and joined again and unified with the South Union Association, and now it is the South Union Mount Zion Association of Baptist Churches, it's actually the South Union Mount Zion Baptist Association. And in 2015, they celebrated 200 years of membership with 50 churches. I went to their associational meeting, the 202nd associational meeting a couple of weeks ago. They're just outside of Williamsburg, and just to see what they had going on, just to be a part of that. And so the association, like I said, with 50 churches going strong, and again, most of those are within that within that same geographical region: Whitley County, McCurry County, Campbell County, Scott County, and maybe a few on the outskirts. Let me throw just a few things from their history that are going to be at least relevant in our discussion. In 1891, the association asked its churches to restrict the number of messengers that they sent to the associational meeting, the assembly, if you will. They were asked to restrict the number of delegates that they sent to one delegate for every 25 members. Before that, there was no restriction, and so you might have a church that had 25 people, but they sent 20 of them to the association meeting to vote and participate. Another church may have had 150 members. They only had 3 that could go. And so when you see the lists of the numbers of messengers, there's no restriction, and you can't say, well, that church only had 3 delegates, or they only had 1. That must not have been a very big church. There was no, and sometimes geography played a part. For example, the host church. They might have 25 down there just because it was easier for people to get there.
What year was that?
That was in 1891.
When they said the restriction?
When they asked the churches, they asked the churches to do it voluntarily. But I mention it because I want you to see how that's going to affect ourselves later on down the road, right? That the idea of limiting the number of delegates to each church to 2 delegates, at least it has its roots in our Baptist heritage. In 1895, it was ordered that each church submit a list of ordained ministers in order to be printed in the minute book. So the idea is, let's list all of the preachers by name, those who have credentials, those who are in good standing, so that we know in our association, if we need somebody to call upon, for example, to be a pastor, call upon so that their names or their addresses were listed in the minute book. The first ministers list was added to their minutes. In 1898, they dropped the word delegate and started using the word messenger. Now they're going to change that later on. They're going to go back to the word delegate. But I mentioned that because 9 years later, at the first assembly of the Church of God Mountain Assembly, we don't have any delegates, we have messengers. And so you see again, they took the terminology of the structure that they were familiar with and they brought it with them. In 1901, there was a poll of the churches, sent a letter out asking the church to give your opinion on the subject, to determine whether they wanted a meeting, the associational meeting, restricted to ministers only, or whether they wanted to open it up, leave it open as it had been for the ministers and the delegates, the lay members from the local church. And so they were already beginning to think about whether or not to restrict the meeting to only the ministers. And this is going to be important again in a couple weeks when we get to the 1940s, because Church of God Mountain Assembly is going to have that same conversation, and we'll talk about that when we get there. But just to familiarize yourself with some of the historical ideas that were involved. Let me talk about how these association meetings, just some of the features of them. And the first thing I want to mention, and this is not an order of business. It's just sharing some things that typically happen in the associational meeting. First of all, there would be a reading of the church letters. Each church would send a letter to the association listing the names of its messengers. These are our delegates. Of course, they would be asked to list who the pastor is, who the clerk is. Typically, they would want to know on what day they had their meeting and other information. These letters were read. They were read publicly in the association meeting until 1970. They continued to read them until 1970. And so they listed the names of any number of delegates from the churches, along with the church moderator or pastor, the clerk, and it was by lettering in that the church was joining the association for another year. We're going to participate. We're going to be a part of the association, and so the letter was an important part of belonging to the association. there's almost always some note on hospitality. So that, some resolution that was passed that was thanking the members of the community and the church for their hospitality. The idea is 100 years ago when people came in to stay for a few days in a particular community, there were no motels, there were no restaurants. If you had people that were coming to stay for a few days meeting and attend church services, typically the host church, the pastor would get up and say to his congregation, we've got a family of 5 here that needs a place to stay. Here's another family of 3. And basically the people in the community would take them home and would keep them in their homes for 2 or 3 days, feeding them, giving them a place to stay, and so that they could participate in the association meeting. That practice continued in the Church of God Mountain Assembly, in some cases right up into the 50s. Where the pastor and the pastor's wife would do everything they could to accommodate the travelers that would come in to make sure that they got them places to stay. So they would always extend thanks to the community, to the church, for its hospitality. There would be an election of officers. These typically included a moderator. The moderator would conduct the business session for that meeting. It was not a position where he held it for a year or this and that and the other, but basically he was elected at the beginning of the association meeting. The association meeting would typically be called to order by whoever had been the moderator the previous year, and they would conduct an election by ballot, and they would elect a moderator and an assistant moderator in case the meeting got long and somebody else needed to fill the chair, you wanted to sit down or whatever. They'd have a moderator, an assistant moderator, and a clerk, and sometimes an assistant clerk. And sometimes they would appoint people different. Sometimes the clerk would be responsible for reading the letters along with maybe somebody else. You imagine trying to read 25 letters? By the time you got done, your throat would be dry. And so they would elect officers. They would always appoint a committee on divine services. The Divine Services Committee, what?
Sounds like competition.
No. The Divine Services Committee was what we call today a program committee. The only difference was the Divine Services Committee would choose preachers for that convention that was taking place that week. And so you would have during the business session, for example, that morning you might say the Divine Services Committee reports that tonight such and such will be preaching. Now in these churches, sometimes, this was a big thing. The association meeting was a big thing. And sometimes the church wasn't big enough to hold everybody. So they might have preaching in different places. So the Divine Services Committee would say, tonight at the church house, Reverend Silcox is going to be preaching. And then over at, at some, maybe at an outdoors place, or maybe at or a community building, or in somebody's home. They might have 3 or 4 different services that would go on, but the Divine Services Committee would announce these are who is preaching tonight, and this is who's going to be preaching in the morning. These were the other services that would take place. Typically, there would be an introductory sermon that was preached that preceded the business, and the introductory sermon, the one that preached it, the keynote speaker, if you will, he was chosen the previous year. They would have a vote at the end of the business session where they would vote on who's going to preach the introductory sermon. Eventually, the South Union Association adopted a second annual sermon where the introductory sermon was preached prior to business, and then they would have a doctrinal sermon that was delivered the second day. Sometimes there would be corresponding letters that would be read. The associations would have their meeting, and I mentioned all the associations that came out of the South Union Baptist Association, these other groups. Sometimes the other associations would formally send representatives from the West Union. We're here from the West Union Baptist Association. They would bring a letter from their association, maybe giving a report on the welfare of their organization and pledging their support, continued friendship, and brotherhood to the South Union Association. And so these letters would be read, and then oftentimes there would be a response that would be sent. We'll send a letter of greetings, and they'll pick some people from our association to go to their association when it meets, in next month or whenever. And so there would be correspondence between the 2 associations. And in the next hour, we'll talk about why that's important. Another thing that typically took place was circular letters. These were often written to send to the churches. Somebody would write basically what they were doing was they were writing a sermon or writing a doctrinal letter. The Bible was the only doctrine. But their articles of faith were printed annually in the minutes, and they were a guideline. And so sometimes they would send a representative to the churches to help or to help solve some of those problems that they might have, or to address a particular doctrinal stance, and send those letters to be read. Just like in the New Testament days, when you finish reading this letter, send it to Hierapolis and read the letter that I sent to them also. The first Sabbath schools were established in the 1870s, and the local churches eagerly anticipated reporting on the progress of those schools at the associational meeting. And then the association would always draft resolutions. They'd have some sort of committee, a resolution committee that would draft resolutions on and show their opinion on almost every imaginable subject. Subjects like liquor, excluded ministers, advice to ministers, every possible subject. One of the recent letters from about 25 years or so ago was about lottery tickets and their advice to convenience stores to open up a second line so that people who are buying lottery tickets wouldn't, cause you to take so much time. They weren't condemning selling the lottery tickets altogether, but just have a separate line so as folks who don't buy them. But that's good advice. But that was the kind of thing that they sent. Let's talk about the holiness controversy. And in the next 9.5 minutes, let's talk about this break. We talked about the holiness movement. So now we're bringing the Reformation and holiness together in one. I'm going to talk about two individuals in particular, Elders John Parks and Andrew Silcox. Two men, they're called elders in the minutes of the South Union Association. And don't confuse that again. The word elder and pastor are sometimes used simultaneously. You probably would never call a 20-year-old an elder. Unless you're a Mormon, you'd never, refer to somebody like. But so usually there was some experience that was behind it too before you typically call someone an elder. But both John Parks and Andrew Silcox were elders in the sense that it was used in the South Union Association. John Hansford Parks was born July 5th, 1861. He married Rachel Thomas July 16th, 1880. Andrew J. Silcox, was born November the 5th, 1863, just a couple years younger. He married Jane Alvis Thomas June the 3rd, 1883, just a few years later. Rachel and Jane were two of the daughters of Daniel Thomas and Nancy Broyles Thomas. Two sisters married John Parks and Andrew Silcox. Another sister, another brother, Daniel Jr., was married to John Parks' half-sister, Emma. You say, well, that sounds like a close-knit family. If that wasn't close enough, Daniel Thomas, that I mentioned just a moment ago, is the brother of Helen Thomas Parks, who is John's mother. Yes, John Parks married his first cousin. It was not illegal in the state of Kentucky at that time. It is now, but it was not at that time. Nor was it uncommon to marry your first cousin. John Parks had been orphaned at a young age. His dad had died when he was very young, and so it seemed natural. Marry your uncle's daughter. You think the Thomas family is large. This Daniel Thomas that was their father, that was Rachel and Jane's father. Daniel's father, Robert Thomas, is the grandfather of 5 delegates at the First Assembly, not counting these 2 granddaughters who married Parks and Silcox. to the founding father. So there's 7 individuals who are grandchildren of Robert Thomas by blood or by marriage. So when somebody asks you who the founder of the Church of God Mountain Assembly is, Robert Thomas might be a good guess. Both Parks and Silcox began preaching in about 1888. Silcox preached his first sermon January 23rd in 1889. So Parks just a little before Silcox, both of them preaching at the United Baptist Church at Wolf Creek. Let's talk about John Parks just a moment. Parks was a delegate at the South Union Association since 1889. So about the time he started preaching, he started attending the annual association meeting. He was just popular enough that he preached the introductory sermon. We talk about this is the keynote message that's voted on a year ahead of time. He preached the introductory sermon in 1891 from 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 1 through 3. He preached the introductory sermon again in 1897 from 2 Corinthians 11:14. He preached in 1901 from 1 Timothy 3:16. So 3 times within 12 years of starting preaching, he was popular enough, chosen to be the preacher of the introductory sermon. He served as moderator of the South Union Association in 1897, again in 1898, in 1901, and in 1902. And so you can see there are 2 different years during this period of time, 2 different years where Parks not only preached the introductory sermon, but also was chosen as moderator. Let's talk about Andrew Silcox. Silcox was a delegate at the South Union Association since 1890. So again, year after he started preaching, he began to be involved with the association meetings. He preached the introductory sermon 4 times during the period of time we're looking at. He actually preached it again another time later on. But in 1892, 1896, 1900, and 1902, he preached the introductory sermon. This is during this span of time we're looking at, 8 times someone who became a part of the Church of God Mountain Assembly in the first decade of the 20th century was preaching the keynote message at the South Union Baptist Association. Silcox also was elected moderator in 1899 and 1900. There was a span of 6 years in a row where somebody from what became the Church of God Mountain Assembly served as moderator of the association, or 5 times in 6 years. We'll talk about the origins of holiness. How did holiness come into? At the end of Luther Gibson's history book, he tells and began preaching Wesleyan holiness. That a man can be empowered by Christ and by the Holy Ghost to live without sin. Bryant says that among the first 2 to receive the blessing of sanctification, the first 2 to embrace it, were John Thomas, who's a cousin of those other Thomases that we just talked about, and Anderson Alder, 2 men that he said were among the first to get to become sanctified. At some point, that doctrine was embraced by John Parks and Andrew Silcox and others. My estimate is that somewhere, when we don't have exact records, we have personal testimonies of different people that testified about getting sanctified at certain times. There is no reference to sanctification or modern apostasy or dangerous doctrine or anything like that. There's no reference to that in the South Union Association minutes prior to 1902. No reference at all. In 1903, they start to take that tells me the fact that Parks and Silcox were still preaching introductory sermons and they were still being elected moderator. They're still in good standing with the association, so they're certainly not preaching heresy at this point in time. But somewhere about 1902 or 1903, they began to embrace this doctrine. And in 1902, the South Union Association advised churches to exclude and call in the credentials of any minister or member who teaches doctrines contrary to the Articles of Faith of United Baptist Churches. In 1903, they said, beware of men who are members of Baptist churches who are advancing a doctrine contrary to the Articles of Faith of the United Baptist Church, and not to invite such a one to preach. They appointed a committee of 8 to investigate churches where this is reported. And somewhere about 1904, the disputed doctrine came to the attention of the association, and in particular in the local church in Wolf Creek. At the end of the 1903 assembly, John Parks had been selected to preach the introductory sermon in 1904. They show up in 1904, and before he can preach the sermon, somebody makes a motion. Let's table the sermon until we hear the report of the Committee on Disputed Doctrine. They heard the report, and when they were finished, they ended up saying, well, we'll have the sermon tomorrow. And they appointed a committee of 9 to meet with John Parks and A.J. Silcox and others in regard to disputed doctrine. And then later that year, they passed a motion to withdraw fellowship from Little Wolf Creek and Zion Hill Church. Sometime around this same time at Wolf Creek, John Parks was pastoring the church at Wolf Creek, not to be confused with Little Wolf Creek, 2 different churches, just a few miles apart, but they're 2 different churches. At Wolf Creek, they were having a meeting. J.H. Bryant tells the story. Mom and Dad were members of the church at Wolf Creek. They had a meeting to discuss the change. John Parks got up and he said, they claim we're preaching heresies, a doctrine contrary to the articles of faith and rules of decorum of the Baptist Church. Now we're going to ask the church to vote on what you're going to do. Take your articles of faith and rules of decorum, the ones laid down by man, or are you going to take the Bible? All that vote for the Bible instead of man's work are voting for us to remain as your pastors. And all that vote against the Bible are voting us out as pastors, because we're going to stay with the Bible. And Bryant says they voted the Bible out by a large majority. When that happened, Alex Dickerson rose up and asked for his letter. Give me we'll take our name off the books. His wife wanted her moved, and then there were others, many others, that asked for their letter. And so this group of people that left Wolf Creek, they formed a church that they named the Holiness Baptist Church. One night at Patterson Creek, I mentioned Anderson Alder was one of the first to get sanctified. One night at Patterson Creek, Stephen Bryant was pastoring, and he was up preaching. While he was preaching, Brother Alder would shout out, "Glory, hallelujah," during the meeting that night. And he would do that periodically, and it interrupted Brother Bryant, who was trying to preach. And so he called him down. He told him to hold his peace until after he finished his sermon. And so, of course, he felt real good about the way he treated him. Told him what. And so after the service was over, Brother Alder came to him and just hugged him by the neck and told him, "God bless you, Brother Brian, I love you." And went on his way home, and on his way home said, "Glory, hallelujah." And so this bothered Stephen Bryant about the way that he had acted and the way he had treated him, and then for him to turn around and love him anyway. After I embarrassed this man, he should have had a different attitude. So it weighed heavy on his heart all night long, and couldn't sleep at night. And so he spent the night in prayer. Sometime in the middle of the night, Brother Bryant screamed out, "Glory, hallelujah!" Something like lightning had struck through his heart. And he said, "This guy's got something that you don't have," or he couldn't have acted that way. And so in the middle of the night, he cries out this, "Glory, hallelujah!" And his wife said, Sister Mary said, "Stephen, hush! Everybody in the neighborhood's going to think you're sanctified." And he said, "Thank God. That is what has happened." He said, "Right now I wish the whole world knew it." And so in 1905, 2 letters were received at the South Union Baptist Association from the church at Maple Creek. One church pastored by John Parks, the other church pastored by someone else, and the letter by Parks was rejected. He's not a part of us. And so that year, 1905, a resolution was adopted, and it said this specifically. It said, "Be it resolved that we advise all our churches to beware of all men who preach doctrine contrary to the Word of God, such doctrine as modern sanctification and apostasy. Be it further resolved that we advise them not to allow them to be pastors of the churches or preach in their church houses, and advise all of our churches in our bounds not to call John Parks, A.J. Silcox, Alan Moses, T.D. Moses, Stephen Bryant, N.K. Parks, A. Thomas, or anyone else guilty of heresy as pastor or to preach in our churches. Any church holding one of the above brethren as pastor is advised to remove them at once any church not obeying this advice will be considered out of harmony with this assembly. And so by 1905, the ties between these men who had been Baptist in their doctrine, Baptist in their practice, who had embraced Wesleyan holiness and experienced sanctification for themselves, these men were formally disfellowshipped and told, if the churches were told, if you keep them as pastor, you're no longer with, you're no longer part of the association, and churches were advised to not call upon them as pastor. And so the relationship between our founding fathers and the Baptist church came to a conclusion then in 1905 at that association meeting.